Looking for a knife that's more than just metal? The Rainy Forge handcrafts blades in a real coal forge, the way they were meant to be made. Every knife is meticulously crafted, hair-popping sharp, and built to last a lifetime. From hunting to cooking, we've got a blade for you. Affordable heirloom quality. Visit therainyforgeblacksmith.com and click Buy a Knife to get started. The Rainy Forge, built with tradition, ready for your adventure.
Shooters, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts, Emax Tactical has you covered. We offer specialty, exotic, and vintage ammunition you won't find anywhere else. Plus, field medical kits and civilian legal training. Emax Tactical is passionate about helping customers find exactly what they need. 90% of orders go out the same day. Visit Emax Tactical online and use code TODD for 10% off your first order. Visit us at emaxtactical.com. EMACStactical.com.
Attention, you're listening to the Todd Huff Radio Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be advised that the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. Here's your conservative, but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Well, that is right, my friends. You have tuned in to America's home for conservative, not bitter talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. It is my pleasure to be here again. If you're watching on Rumble or on video on our website, which you can now see us here and realize that we do, yes, have a face, in fact, for radio, you'll find that my eye, this is going to be a problem for the rest of the spring. I just have to announce it because I get questions about it. Are you crying? You know what? Sometimes I feel like it, but today I don't feel like it. I simply have allergy problems, my friends, so it's affecting the old right eye. So, anyway, today, what do I want to get to? I want to get to, look, it's April Fool's Day. This is no joke. We've got Cory Booker out there who's giving a marathon speech. He thinks he's an American hero by having the courage and the strength to speak for whatever it is now, 4, I don't know what he's going to get up to. The last I saw it was 13 hours. For as long as he is physically able to speak. What a hero, my friends. His second Spartacus moment in his lifetime as a U.S. Senator. He's out there talking in his on the Senate floor to protest President Trump, which is so brave and so courageous and so effective. So we got that going on. But really where I want to start today, by talking about this issue regarding due process, this issue regarding the deportation of criminal illegal aliens that are members of Tren de Aragua, which is a gang, a violent criminal gang. And I want to talk about this, and I want to give both sides of this as fairly as I can give it. I want to give the side of the people who are concerned about the due process, quote unquote, rights of the folks who are in allegedly members of this gang. And I want to talk about Trump's position, and I want to paint the picture, and then you can decide. Look, I'm telling you, this is not, there are some folks want you to believe that if you're in favor of due process rights, you can't be in favor of this. I don't think that that's an accurate depiction, and I'll go through why, but it doesn't mean, listen, you still may side with the folks that say that the way that Trump is handling this needs to be adjusted, and that's okay. That's a decision that I think you should be able to make, but you should at least get the full information. That's what I'm going to provide to you today. I'll give you my thoughts along the process, along the road of this discussion as well. And so we are going to start here today, though, by reminding you, well, actually to thank you on behalf of one of our advertisers, Mike Lindell and his employees at MyPillow. I want to personally thank you for your continued support. And they also want you to know that they have a big allotment of bed sheets that were earmarked for the box stores. I combined earmarked and boxed there. They were earmarked for the box stores this spring, but of course they did it again. The box stores didn't come through, so they're going to pass the savings on to you. So basically what happened is they ordered stuff that was going to go to the box stores. It didn't. The box stores backed out or whatever happened there. And so they have a big order of sheets, and they want to pass along to you the savings because there's no middleman now. They're going to give you the chance to get these wholesale prices on their famous Giza Dreams bed sheets. Giza Dream queen size is normally $139.98. Your wholesale price is $69.99. King size is only $79.99. Percolate, how do I say that? Queen size normally $89.98. It's wholesale price at $29.98. King size only $34.98. So you've got some really deep discounts here. You can get those by going to mypillow.com and use promo code Todd. There's also some free shipping options available. This allotment is not going to last long, my friends. When they're gone, they're gone. Remember, mypillow.com, promo code Todd. And the reason they're here is because they've got a box store that, again, has created some problems for MyPillow because, well, that's what they've tended to do since, MyPillow has upset some of the folks in woke business. MyPillow.com, promo code Todd. That's something that you'll want to take advantage of quickly because I don't know how long that'll last. Anyway, so there you go. I want to talk due process. Due process for members of the gang Tren de Aragua. Now, you'll notice that, again, we're going to do a fair analysis. So let's start here. Let's start here as I do this breakdown and analysis. What is due process? What is due process? So as an American citizen, as someone here in the United States, and this, by the way, this would apply to anyone who is here in the United States. If you are arrested in the United States for allegedly breaking a crime, you have certain rights. This is referred to loosely as due process. It's a procedure. It says, look, you've been charged with something, but we have a process to prevent you from being basically targeted for political purposes or just having a case that's made up out of the clear blue sky, have a case brought against you, and then you can't defend yourself. You don't know who your accusers are, all this sort of stuff. And so there's due process rights that exist. And so due process involves a lot of things, but you get the idea, the general gist of it. It would be things like the right to a fair trial, the right to an attorney or counsel, as they like to say. There's the right to face your accusers. That's a due process right. People who are witnesses against you, your attorney can cross-examine those. This is all done in a public hearing. You have the right to see the evidence brought against you. You have the right to present your own evidence. You have the right to appeal. When you're arrested, you are read your Miranda rights, which reminds you that you have the right to remain silent. This prevents you against having to incriminate yourself, testify against yourself. You have the right to remain silent, as they say. This just gives you an idea, right? Double jeopardy is another thing. You can't be charged for the same crime twice. They can't just keep trying and trying until they get you. Now, I read all that, and I would just ask you, I don't want to venture off this path, but just ask or just picture Donald Trump and what's been happening to him over the course of the past couple of years now, and ask yourself, is that what applied there? Anyway, moving on from that. That's what due process is. And again, there may be things I left out. I'm just painting a general picture to say that is when you face criminal charges in this country, those are the things that you're entitled to. And again, it also includes people who are not, if you're from another country and you commit a crime here. Now, it's interesting because this is where it gets a little bit muddy for me because the courts could make a decision just to deport somebody. You don't have to. You might still want to, but you don't have to charge someone of a crime if they've been arrested. If they're someone who shouldn't be here, they can go through the deportation process, which has a variation of this, but it's different. It's not criminal charges at that point. It's a deportation hearing where you might actually be deported from the country because you're not legally allowed to be here in the first place. So anyone who's charged with a crime has these rights, but if you're here illegally, there could be another process that you go down, so to speak, the deportation hearing process. Now, let's think about who has these rights. I mentioned anyone who's here is going to be given those rights, but let's paint a picture here for a moment, and then we're going to get into the act that President Trump is referencing called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Some people think that it matters how old the law is. It's an old law. You can't use it anymore. That's not the way that works. You use any law that's on the books. In fact, many of the common laws that we base our system of justice upon, our society upon, those things are very old. But see, when you find something that is true and you find something that is good, then you don't deviate from it. This is, again, I don't want to deviate too far from our path here, but this is the same thing, when you think about the nature of God. God is perfect. God tells us he doesn't change. And the reason he doesn't change is because he is already perfect. So if he changes anything that is perfect, it is going to be moving away from perfection. And he can't do that. He's perfect. He's without fault. He's all good. So the same is true here with the way that we live. If we find a series of laws that are good or things that are good and true, we want to adhere to those. We want to follow those. We don't want to just let those fade away into oblivion. We want to pass those along to the next generation. We want them to understand what we have discovered, what has been revealed to us. We want people to realize what is good and true and noble and all that, and pass it on down through the millennia. These things, there are timeless truths, my friend, that don't need to change. And when we find those things, we need to hang on to those things tightly. So this concept of a due process right is a very, very good thing. However, there are questions. There are fair questions. What happens if we're in a war, right? We've been in a lot of wars. The lovers of big government like to start wars. The military-industrial complex, as they say, likes to start wars. Biden sure didn't slow wars down. Trump's the only one that seems interested in slowing down wars. But what happens if you're fighting an enemy combatant in a foreign country? Do we suddenly have due process rights? I mean, due process rights are much different than the rules of engagement on the battlefield. If you're going door to door, as people did, as members of our military did, to root out the evil terrorists that were trying to kill, maim, and destroy Americans and our way of life, they went door to door, risking their lives, giving their lives in many instances to stop these evildoers, to detain them if possible, or to kill them if necessary. I mean, this ultimately came down, this is what happened with Osama bin Laden, with his compound in Pakistan. And yes, I can thank Barack Obama for telling me how to say Pakistan correctly. But anyway, so there's examples of times when due process, like we're in a war, right? You can't be out there reading their Miranda rights. Now, I will say that some of this has crept into the military through the people above, not through the rank and file soldiers and so forth, but from the folks above that are trying to, depending, some of them are trying to, they would say, modernize the forces. Others of them are trying to, I think, weaken the forces. Some folks just simply don't like the use of the American military whatsoever. And so there are some of these rules that have kind of eked their way in there. But in general, we're still talking about two dramatically different things. So now the question remains, what happens if we have a war here on American soil? Heaven forbid that we do that. We have that problem. But what happens? What happens if there's actual enemy combatants here who aren't just criminals, but they are actually at war and have invaded the United States of America? See, now we're to the point where this begins to change the conversation a little bit, because I'd like to think this, even though I am a civil rights, believing in the Constitution, due process, those liberties outlined in that beautiful founding document. But I also understand that there are times when things don't fit that mold, and war would be a prime example. I at least have to grapple with that. It's not just something like, oh yeah, just arrest the guy, read him his Miranda rights, take him into the station, have him questioned, bring in witnesses. No, you're in a war. That's not a practical or even advisable situation to be in. This is in a kill or be killed sort of scenario where we're fighting for the defense of what we have here in this country against enemies that are prepared to do anything necessary to destroy what we have, to terrorize us into submitting to their morally depraved worldview. So in comes this Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Now, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, sometime 18th, 19th of March. We went through what this was. I'm going to do this briefly again, my friends. Briefly. We're not going to go into this too much, but I want to at least paint the picture of this thing and continue this conversation. Before I do that, though, I want to, take a little second here to take a breather. And I also want to point out that I know that you care about this country as Americans. I know that you do, but you can't fight for this country, my friends, if you're not taking care of yourself. That's why I'm here to tell you about Solti. Solti is an all-natural, clinically proven supplement that lowers cholesterol safely. Science is spoken, and this stuff works. No prescriptions, no doctor's visits, just 2 Solti soft gels a day. It is not a drug, but it works. Again, the science is spoken on this, my friends. I take it myself. I think you should consider taking it as well. We need healthy, strong Americans. Yes, for your family. Yes, for your business. Yes, for your faith. Yes, for your community. But also for this great nation as a whole. Don't let high cholesterol slow you down. So you can go to Solti.com, Soltea, Solti.com. Use promo code Todd. That's my name. And you'll save 50% off your first 3-month supply and get free shipping. That's Solti.com. Promo code Todd, my friends. Take advantage of that special offer. All right, so let's get here to this Alien Enemies Act of 1798. I had a summary that I've pulled up with some help of AI, some sophisticated AI that we've got access here to, which is pretty incredible. But I want to read a part of this to you. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a significant piece of legislation in United States history, enacted during a period of heightened political tension and fear of foreign influence. Now, remember, this is in the early days of our country, right? This America is in its infancy still. This act, which remains in effect today, which, by the way, they do unless they're taken off the books by another law or by repealing an actual law. So it's still on the books. It grants the President of the United States broad powers to detain or deport non-citizens from hostile nations during times of war or when an invasion is threatened. So that's the gist of it. Now, the question is, okay, can you only face war and invasion from, say, the leadership of from the president of a country, right? Does it have to involve the military? These are questions. Look at what happened on October 7th in Israel. That was an act of war, and they didn't come across with tanks and, in military uniforms. They came across as individual terrorists. And so while some people would maintain this is for an actual declared war situation, others would say it is an invasion. It is a threat of warlike activities from a group of people wreaking havoc on American citizens. And so again, you can determine your interpretation from that. It might determine how you view the outcome of this. But nonetheless, let's look back at this. I've got a couple of minutes here, this segment. The act was passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress in 1798 during the quasi-war with France. It was part of a package of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which you have probably heard about and learned about in school, which included the Naturalization Act, the Alien Friends Act, and the Sedition Act. These laws were enacted in response to fears of French influence and espionage within the United States, as well as to suppress political opposition for the Democratic Republican Party. Now, There's 4 key provisions here in this piece of legislation. Number 1 is presidential authority. The act empowers the president to issue proclamations identifying and managing alien enemies, including the power to apprehend, restrain, secure, and remove non-citizens who are natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of a hostile nation. So, that's pretty broad, right? Pretty broad authority. The scope of the act applies to males aged 14 and older who are not naturalized U.S. citizens. So that one's pretty cut and dry, right? Now you're looking at people who are of a certain age and a certain gender, although the left would have trouble with this because what if all these folks suddenly identified as female? They would say that this law doesn't apply, which is preposterous. Goes to show just how insane some of these things are that the left believes. But anyway, so that's the second key provision. The third is the conditions for invocation. The act can be invoked during a declared war. So we don't have that. We don't have a declared war, but there's this little word called or when an invasion or predatory incursion is threatened or attempted against the United States. Now we're beginning to use language, or this piece of legislation is using language that may be very appropriate to our situation. When an invasion or predatory incursion is threatened or attempted against the United States. Is Tren de Aragua engaging in an invasion or a predatory incursion? Are they threatening it? Are they attempting it? They've certainly attempted it, right? So again, now you can begin to see that, hey, this is not that far. This is not that far removed from what the early founders basically were trying to do here with this legislation. Fourth key provision. Courts and judges are authorized to handle complaints against alien enemies and can order their removal or require sureties for their good behavior. All right, so you can begin to see that this is a little bit more in Trump's favor than people would have you believe, because they don't want to talk about this act specifically and the reason. Now remember, the other thing to remember is this law was crafted. You know, they talk about its age as though having it be that far in the past is actually kind of outdated today. I would maintain that having something written so closely to when the Constitution was adopted, it's probably a lot of the same people are still around, still having influence on the legislation and so forth. And now we have a piece of legislation with the founding fathers sitting there, right? The founding fathers, it's kind of like when the early church was around and you had some of the disciples who were there with Jesus. They could have said, no, that's not exactly how Jesus explained it to us, right? So there's a little bit of that going on here. So I think that this needs to be considered. Now, there's some people who say, well, look, the act itself should be unconstitutional because it takes away the due process rights. I would say that at least you can make the case that it's defining when due process law is actually legitimate and when we're fighting for the survival of our country, dealing with foreign enemy combatants who do not get due process rights as someone in America would. So that's where this is headed. I just looked at the clock. I need to take a break, my friends. Quick time out. We'll continue this conversation a little bit here into the next segment. You're listening here to Conservative, Not Bitter Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute.
At FurnitureMadeInUSA.com, we provide beautiful chairs, rockers, stools, and tables handcrafted by skilled American artisans in North Carolina since 1924. With every purchase, you're supporting American businesses, American workers, and their families. Don't just buy furniture. Invest in a piece of American history. Shop now at FurnitureMadeInUSA.com.
Hello, it's your favorite president telling Todd Huff listeners about MAGA Milk Protein Powder. That's what we're calling it, MAGA Milk. It's protein for patriots, okay? American-made MAGA milk destroys dad bods and builds a big, beautiful wall of MAGA muscle on your entire body. So true. Don't buy protein made in China. You'll be a total disaster, a weak loser. Your workouts are winning. Drink MAGA milk. Go to MAGAmuscle.com and put some Trump in your pump. MAGAmuscle.com.
Shooters, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts, Emax Tactical has you covered. We offer specialty, exotic, and vintage ammunition you won't find anywhere else. Plus, field medical kits and civilian legal training. Emax Tactical is passionate about helping customers find exactly what they need. 90% of orders go out the same day. Visit Emax Tactical online and use code TODD for 10% off your first order. Visit us at emaxtactical.com. EMACStactical.com.
Welcome back, my friends. I gotta tell you, I'm not a fan of these allergies. Got a watery eye. Got a little bit of sneezing this morning. I've got just the allergy symptoms here in the studio. I'll be fine, but it definitely does not make me look good on the video, which you can see at Rumble or on our website, my friends. All right, so we've been going through this, trying to be fair here, trying to give the full picture of what's going on regarding the use of the Alien Enemies Act, talking about due process, who has the rights to the due process that we talked about at the top of the program. Are there instances where an enemy combatant would not be granted the due process because we're in a warlike situation? I think our early folks who were in this country early understood this. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened in times of war that they're different. Look, I know that it can be abused. I fully understand that. But I also understand that there's legitimate reasons to realize, hey, we have to handle things differently here because we are dealing with the survival of this republic. This is not just normal maintenance and the application of justice in our society and making sure, obviously, that innocent people are given the rights to defend themselves and that this government is not used as a blunt force instrument to make sure that people fall into line and do what the government wants them to do. We obviously don't want that, but we also understand that there are times and circumstances that fall outside what would be considered normal and standard, and war is one of those obvious examples. So, going back to the summary I've been reading here, referencing here during the program, a summary of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, the implementation and the effects of this law. So while the act was not heavily enforced immediately after its passage, it set precedent for the treatment of foreign nationals during wartime. Its most notable applications came during World War I and World War II, when it was used to detain and deport German, Japanese, and Italian nationals. And we know that it was not handled properly during that period of time, especially as it pertained to the internment camps the Japanese were subjected to. The long-term impact and the modern relevance of this act. This again is a one-page summary of this act that I've been going through here. The Alien Enemies Act had a lasting impact on U.S. legal and political frameworks concerning national security and immigration. It has influenced subsequent legislation and executive actions, particularly in times of conflict. In the post-9/11 era, the principles underlying the act have been echoed in the new security measures and legislation such as the U.S. Patriot Act. The act continues to be a point of reference in contemporary debates about the balance between national security and civil liberties. It serves as a case study in the potential for government overreach and the importance of safeguarding individual rights. There have been calls for legislative reforms to address the potential for abuse inherent in the act, focusing on ensuring that national security measures do not disproportionately impact specific ethnic or national groups. In conclusion, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 remains a significant and controversial piece of legislation reflecting the ongoing challenges of balancing national security with civil liberties in the United States. So, there you go. That is what I would call a fair summary of the circumstances at hand today. So, in essence, if you're part of an enemy combatant group, as defined by the president, at least that's certainly an interpretation of the Alien Enemies Act, then you can be deported without the typical due process because we find ourselves more in a warlike scenario and situation than we find ourselves in a situation where someone is just involved in typical, if you want to use that word, criminal conduct. And again, I think we all recognize that there's a difference. I heard Scott Jennings on CNN ask this. So he was being hammered on this. Are you, certainly you're in favor of due process rights, Scott, for all people in this country. This isn't just for American citizens. This should be for anybody. And of course, Scott Jennings would say, yes, I'm for due process rights. However, are we so naive to think that if terrorists just suddenly started walking across our border that we have to fight the war on terrorism using our system of civil liberties? Or is there something else that kicks into our brain and to our common sense that says, hey, this is not the way that you can fight this group of people that are not engaged in just criminal activity. They're actually seeking the downfall of the United States of America, the destruction and the mass killing of her citizens. Surely that's different. Surely we're dealing with different circumstances here than just mere criminal misconduct or some such thing. So, if they do that, if terrorists do that, do we suddenly have to treat them like criminals instead of enemy combatants and terrorists? I would say that seems like an obvious no to me, though I also understand that the line gets a little bit blurred and it can become a little bit hard to draw. And a lot of people, when the line becomes blurry, want to resort to a black and white scenario because they don't. And listen, I get it. There's the slippery slope argument, right? If you let a president make a claim about a particular group of people, how can that not be in the future abused by a president who then categorizes American citizens? So I would say that clearly is not allowed by this act. But again, someone might make the case that this could be abused, and it certainly could be abused, but it could also be an obvious, I guess the other way to say it is, if it's not used, then we're allowing people to abuse our system to harm us. And that is obviously not a good thing to do either. So, the other side of this, however, what happens if there are innocent people that get swept up into this? What if there are people who the government claims are part of this gang, but they're not? What if there are people who simply are those that should be deported through the typical process, but they're not people who are members of Tren de Aragua? What if they're not part of this group that Trump says is waging war and invading this country, threatening our citizens gravely? I saw Joe Rogan say that this, I haven't seen it reported, maybe I've just missed it, but Joe Rogan said there was a case of someone who said that, well, that's allegedly been the case. They've been caught up in this. They're not part of the gang, but they've been sent off with the rest of these gang members to some really dark places. This prison that's holding these folks today. That's clearly concerning. We don't want that to happen either. So is the only solution to stop it altogether? I ask this for you to think about. Is the only solution to stop it altogether? Or is the solution to still try to understand that there are two sides of this coin, that the civil liberties of Americans and those who are here who are not engaged in trying to wage war and have made themselves an enemy combatant invading this country, is there something to be said for that argument? So that's really the bottom line here. But we have to recognize, I don't want a single person, even if they're here illegally, to be caught up in this Tren de Aragua thing and be shipped off to some of these brutal places when they simply just need to be deported through the normal processes. Now, there's a lot of things that have created this problem that we find ourselves in. A lot of things that got us here to begin with. And one of the things is that we've had a government and previous administrations that did everything in their power not to enforce the law. They did everything in their power. I've gone through that on this program before. They have tried with all of their might to avoid following the law when it comes to illegal immigration. The Biden administration did it. Really, they all did it outside of Trump. They tried their best not to enforce the law. There were laws on the book clearly all this time, and these laws were not enforced. I mean, how else do you explain a 94% decrease in illegal border crossings within 30 days or so of Trump taking office when you compare February of 24 to February of 25? There is no logical way, my friends, to explain that. How do you explain that people who are here illegally are now paying coyotes not to smuggle them across the border into the United States, but rather they are paying coyotes to smuggle them across the border out of the United States? The only way to describe that is, for the first time in a long time, this country is actually enforcing the laws on the books. Now, just because we didn't make sure that previous administrations followed the law doesn't mean that Trump gets to break the law simply to make up for all of the law breaking that was allowed to happen under the previous administrations. However, I do find it interesting that all the opposition is put against President Trump, put against his desire to try to secure this border, to try to get people out of this country who aren't supposed to be here legally. I understand we just went through the whole thing. I understand that, but I also find it interesting and worth noting that the only time there really is legal opposition is when someone is trying to enforce actual immigration law and deportations. That's really the only time that this becomes an issue. So, a little bit more to say about that on the other side of the break. I have to take a time out, though, real quick, my friends. You're listening here to Conservative, Not Better Talk. I am your host, Todd Huff, back in just a minute.
Looking for a knife that's more than just metal? The Rainy Forge handcrafts blades in a real coal forge, the way they were meant to be made. Every knife is meticulously crafted, hair-popping sharp, and built to last a lifetime. From hunting to cooking, we've got a blade for you. Affordable heirloom quality. Visit therainyforgeblacksmith.com and click Buy a Knife to get started. The Rainy Forge, built with tradition, ready for your adventure.
Tired of store-bought produce? Ever dreamed of growing your own healthy food but worried about space? Exo Hydroponics is a perfect solution. Exo Hydroponics is a family-owned business run by a mother and daughter team. Their innovative Exo Tower lets you grow up to 28 plants indoors or out, using less than 2 square feet. Visit exotowers.com today and start your journey to growing fresh organic food at home. That's exotowers.com.
At FurnitureMadeInUSA.com, we provide beautiful chairs, rockers, stools, and tables handcrafted by skilled American artisans in North Carolina since 1924. With every purchase, you're supporting American businesses, American workers, and their families. Don't just buy furniture, invest in a piece of American history. Shop now at FurnitureMadeInUSA.com.
Welcome back, my friends. If you're in sales, let me ask you, how would you feel if you knew you didn't have to do it alone? Because you don't have to. Matt Easton and Easton University, they are there to help you. They have a system, but it's not just a system, my friends. They give you accountability, and Matt Easton himself will personally jump on a call with you if you become a member, a student of Easton University through our program, ToddHuffShow.com/Easton, EASTON. Matt will personally jump on a call with you and walk you through your situation, your scenario, and help get you plugged in, directed in the, headed in the right direction as quickly as possible, and help you hit the ground running, my friends. So he's going to help you understand your situation. He's going to get an idea of your challenges and your goals. He's going to help you get started with his program. So Matt is, I would say, look, I've been around sales training for a long time. I think what he does is as good as anything I have ever seen. And this goes back all the way to the great Zig Ziglar. I love Zig Ziglar. He did some wonderful things. I learned a lot when I was a young salesperson from him. and from his system and approach, I would put Matt right up there beside Zig as far as his ability to coach and train people. So if you're spinning your wheels, you feel like you're stuck, here's your chance to break through. ToddHuffShow.com/Easton. You can claim your spot at Easton University, and you can get your one-on-one call with Matt when you do that. ToddHuffShow.com/Easton. Friends, invest in yourself and see how far you can go. You are absolutely worth it. I can't see, if you follow his system, I don't see how you don't have tremendous success. All right, so that being said, before the break, I had kind of stopped. We were in the process of talking about what had happened previously in this country when it came to illegal immigration. And I pointed out that previous administrations have done everything in their power not to enforce the law. That's why we got ourselves into this in the first place. I find this interesting, and I think it's noted. It should be noted. I also find it interesting that if you look at when the courts are the most active, it seems to be that they are incredibly active in stopping President Trump. Now, you could say that the reason they are active is because, Todd, we've never had a guy that's tried to push the bounds of the Constitution and statute, try to acquire all of this executive power. And I would say, okay, you can certainly say that. But I could also say, why is there so much opposition to this when a lot of this is pretty clear that he's just using his executive power? Now, some of it, there are questions. What we talked about today, there are legitimate questions about this. But some things that Trump is doing are simply using executive power that he has as the commander-in-chief, as the head of the executive branch. The executive branch is a branch of government. It doesn't answer completely to Congress. There are times that Congress exercises oversight. That's the way our system works. But the President of the United States doesn't work for Congress. The President of the United States works for you. The Congress of the United States does not work for the President of the United States. The members of Congress work for you. The senators used to work for the state legislatures. Now they work for you too. I don't think that's a good idea, but that's where we are. That's not going to change anytime soon. Maybe never. But the bottom line is that there's a whole lot of opposition to this guy. And it appears, if you look at it from a distance, why is the only time that the courts really want to get involved is when we're trying to get people out of this country or stop people from coming into it who aren't supposed to be here. And that, my friends, I think is the real question to ask ourselves. Why is this the way that it is? Now, Trump can certainly abuse his power. A former or future president can abuse their power, but you know what? So can a judge. Why isn't that talked about more often? You know, we find ourselves in many situations today because the judicial branch, this has been talked about for a long time. You want to talk about oligarchy, it's when you have a Supreme Court, an unelected Supreme Court creating law from the bench, which they have done. By the way, that's what Roe versus Wade was. That's why Roe versus Wade was a terrible decision, was because the court just made it up. You know, the left likes to say that a bunch of old white men are telling women what to do with their bodies when it comes to abortion law. But if you want to know exactly the scenario, an exact example of that happening, go back to the court, the Supreme Court in 1973, and look at a bunch of old white men in black robes telling women what they could do with their body. By the way, following no law whatsoever, just creating it out of whole cloth. And we can certainly say that a executive can abuse his power, and a court can abuse its power. Congress can theoretically, it's a little harder because there's so many people there, but Congress could abuse its power. I find it interesting, my friends, when I look at the way things are, when I look at the landscape here, I find myself just amused a little bit here. Of course, the consequences are serious, but it seems like when you think about Congress, they want to do everything but actually what's their job. And when you look at the president, until this president came along, they wanted to do everything but make the tough decisions, do the things that were necessary to enforce the law. So I'm out of time for this hour, my friends. See you on the other side of the hour. Thanks for listening, SDG.
Take the guesswork out of gourmet. Playhouse Spices gives you a leg-up weapon in the kitchen. Playhouse Spices elevates your cooking with gourmet, handcrafted blends made with clean, healthy ingredients. Explore exciting flavors and become a masterful home chef. Visit PlayhouseSpices.com and use code TODD for 20% off your first order over $50. Playhouse Spices. Seek, explore, taste. That's PlayhouseSpices.com.
Shooters, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts, Emax Tactical has you covered. We offer specialty, exotic, and vintage ammunition you won't find anywhere else. Plus, field medical kits and civilian legal training. Emax Tactical is passionate about helping customers find exactly what they need. 90% of orders go out the same day. Visit Emax Tactical online and use code TODD for 10% off your first order. Visit us at EmaxTactical.com. EMACSTactical.com.